Hi, I'm Jan Godsell. I'm a Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Strategy at Loughborough Business School. I've also, for over 5 years, been the co-director of Interact. Interact was a government-funded project looking at how we can create the digital future that we want for manufacturing. And I co-directed the project with Jill McBride from Strathclyde Business School. Now, the piece of work that I looked at was how we can create a methodology or an approach for thinking about the future manufacturing ecosystem and how we can bring groups of people together to create that future that we want. This is divided into 2 parts. First of all, how you create the vision, and then secondly, how you deliver the vision. And what I'm going to share with you now is some insights about how you and your ecosystem can create that vision. This presentation is divided into 3 parts. I'm going to begin by sharing some of the challenges that we were presented with that motivated this work. Then I'm going to talk about some of the trade-offs and how we have to go about thinking about how we address them. And then last but not least, the opportunity for how you can work with your ecosystem to develop that vision. The challenge. Made Smarter Innovation, which was the part of the UK government funding this project, set out a challenge, which was to help UK manufacturing to become the most productive and competitive through the innovation and diffusion of digital technologies and to support manufacturing to achieve net zero by 2050. Now, I don't know what you think, but that's a bit of a mouthful. And I think the average person on the street, or perhaps in UK terms, think about it in your own countries too, but in the UK it would be the average Daily Mail reader, may not necessarily understand what this meant. Now, a few years back, it's probably just over 10 years ago, I was doing some work looking at buy one, get one free deals. So perhaps if you go to a supermarket, you may see that if you buy one item, you might get another free. And as a consumer, you might think that's wonderful. I only have to pay half the price of each of the 2 items. But the reality is buy one, get one free deals aren't so great because actually it's the manufacturer that's funding the free one. On top of that, they often have to put on overtime to produce the extra that's required when they're running the promotion. There might be expedited delivery costs, and they can often get actually fined by the supermarkets if they fail to actually supply during that promotional period. And the reality is it doesn't normally stimulate more demand because if you've bought 2, one might sit in the cupboard and not be used. And so all it does is change the demand pattern rather than necessarily creating new demand. A little bit different when a new product's being launched because it might entice you to try it for the first time and then you'll continue to use it. But generally, these buy one, get one free deals are not the best thing for consumers, and they're certainly not the best thing for manufacturers. So a while back, I was at the annual conference of the National Farmers Union, and I shared this piece of insight because it's particularly important in food supply chains. And there was a journalist there from the Daily Mail, and my comment became public knowledge in the Daily Mail. And surprisingly, 274 Daily Mail readers decided to comment on my article. And if I was to ask you what percentage of Daily Mail readers actually thought or got my idea that buy one, get one free offers aren't actually great for consumers, you'd be much better to have an everyday low price, it was a very small percentage, only about 15% actually got it. On top of that, there was somebody that actually was questioning what a Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Strategy was and suggesting that I was a total waste of taxpayers' money, and somebody else who was very well prepared for COVID, bearing in mind this was 2016, because they argued it was in their right to have a garage full of toilet roll, who was going to take them away from their personal choice. So this perhaps taught me that the way that we present information is really, really important because actually things that are genuinely good for consumers or good for the average Daily Mail reader, if we don't present it in the right way, they might not understand how important it is to them. So we should actually care about the way that we communicate. And so I would perhaps suggest back to Made Smarter Innovation, but more importantly to you in your organisations when you're thinking about doing a digital transformation, what is the language that you're using? Because the Made Smarter Innovation Challenge could be much more simply stated as, are we able to get the stuff we need, when we need it, at the lowest possible cost, in a sustainable and responsible way? And that's ultimately what we're trying to do with our work around supply chains. And if we restate this, if you think about it in terms of what Made Smarter Innovation or the UK government's trying to achieve, the stuff that we need is really just the stuff that we need. It's the stuff that's critical to life, that without it, we wouldn't have a roof over our head, we wouldn't have food, we wouldn't have clothes, we wouldn't have education. And that, in a way, is the stuff that we responsibly should make sure that everyone has. When we need it is about resilience. If I need food today and I can't get it for a month, by that point, something awful may have happened to me. So it's also really, really important that our supply chains are resilient enough to give people things when they need it. At the lowest possible cost, probably, as in government speak, would be productivity. Are we getting sort of best value for money? And in a sustainable way, I would say this is both environmentally and socially sustainable. Can we continue to do this time and time again without crossing our planetary boundaries or increasing societal inequities? So thinking about those 4 terms, let's think about some of the trade-offs this then presents. If we think about the first, thinking about the stuff that we need or the driver around responsibility, I think there's 3 mindset shifts that we need to consider. The first is what we need versus what we want. I want many things. You know, I'm sure it would be great to have a whole wardrobe full of designer clothes, and maybe I could eat caviar and steak and delicious asparagus every day, but it might not be good for me. And there's many things that I may want, but they're not necessarily things that I need. And what that does is it overstimulates consumption, and overstimulating consumption requires us to produce things that we don't need. And what that does is it creates societal inequities, because I might have the money to buy more than I need, but other people in the world may not. And on top of that, if we overproduce, we're probably taking resources out the ground that's damaging our planet. So I'm actually thinking much, much more about what do we actually need rather than what we want is really, really important, both to help make sure that across the planet, everyone has access to what they need, but also it's really important to help us to stay within our planetary boundaries too. Another way that we can help over-consuming and over-producing is perhaps not to have everything new. Or not necessarily to own things as well. So let's take the first one about ownership. Actually, the dress that I'm wearing at the moment, I purchased through Vinted. Vinted is a platform for buying second-hand clothes. So this was pre-loved, and somebody else owned this dress before me. What that meant was I wasn't going out and buying a new one, so I was keeping this dress in its highest possible value state for as long as possible. Actually, the same goes for my jacket too. So actually, yes, I do own this, but someone else has owned it first. And what I'm valuing is the utility in my clothing, not the newness. Another example would be my AirPods I've purchased through the Computer Exchange. That's because with the Computer Exchange, I now get 5 years warranty with those headphones. That means I've got 5 years guaranteed use of my AirPods. If I bought them new, at best, I'd have 1 or 2 years guarantee. So I'd only have 1 or 2 years guaranteed utility. But this requires a mindset shift. In my clothing, I'm actually thinking about the utility of those clothings rather than their newness, similarly with their headphones. But another example could be, ideally, I may not want to own a drill. I might occasionally drill holes in the wall. I don't necessarily have to have one sat there in my garage all the time waiting for me to use it. Imagine if my community, my village, had a set of community tools and I could then borrow the drill when I needed to use it. What I'm then is favouring access and use over ownership. And in that way, rather than everybody in my village owning a drill, we can have one village drill which we can all access when we need it. Now, these points are really important because what they enable us to do is essentially to decouple consumption from production. And up until this point, every stage of our industrial evolution in the developed world has been consumption-driven economic growth. So the way in which we have prospered and the way that we have supported societal development is essentially by enabling our companies to do better because they're able to produce more, which they can sell so people consume more, and it's been, to some extent, a virtuous circle. This virtuous circle is starting to break though, because we're now exceeding our planetary boundaries and societal inequities are getting bigger and bigger. So now is the time to think about new business models where we can actually still ensure that countries prosper, still ensure that we grow, but maybe we might need to redefine growth. And in that way, we decouple consumption from production and start to develop new business models that enable us to thrive in balance, in the words of Kate Raworth. And in this way, we would start to ensure a fairer return to all. Within a UK context, we perhaps talk about, you may have heard terms such as levelling up, which is trying to ensure that all regions across the UK have equal access to resources. In order for this to come about, it can often mean that some that maybe have too much perhaps have to change their mindset a little to enable others that have less to have a bit more. And therein probably lies the biggest and most political challenge of it all. The second point is thinking a bit more about what we need. And this links into the arguments about resilience. And this links a lot into my own area of research, which was looking at not necessarily having one supply chain strategy that fits all, but actually thinking about the different demand patterns that we as consumers create for products. And if you think about something like COVID, during COVID, lots of people said, oh, the reason we didn't have the things that we wanted, it was the failure of just-in-time supply chains. And that just isn't true. Just-in-time is actually a response developed by the Toyota production system for a stable demand pattern. And it worked because Toyota also used to give its suppliers a 3-month lead time or a 3-month order book and 3 months notice of the parts that it wanted. So it was very, very easy for the supply base to then deliver just on time because they had a lot of advanced warning about what was required. But things like this get forgotten about, and we hear this management jargon and we translate it into different contexts. The reality is that every demand pattern, we can buffer against the uncertainty within that demand pattern using relatively simple maths. So the best demand pattern you can have is a very, very stable demand pattern because it's very, very certain, it's very, very predictable. And if I want to, the uncertainty is very small, so any buffer against uncertainty I need is also very small. And those buffers of uncertainty, you can buffer against it using time, using spare manufacturing capacity, using inventory of finished goods or spare parts. But as I say, if it's a nice stable demand pattern, actually I can keep all of those buffers very, very small because it just keeps ticking along. Things like Christmas create a big surge, but it's normally quite a predictable surge, and quite often with events like Christmas, we will basically say we're going to predict what we think we're going to sell. Sometimes we might actually plan to run a little bit short, and when it's gone, it's gone. It's similar to some of the supermarkets you might see like Aldi or Lidl, or even the strategy that Zara uses for its everyday lines. They tend to have this event-style supply chain where they order stuff probably slightly short to what they think they're going to sell, and that in itself creates a way of people responding to it. But we do lots of things within our supply chains that create unpredictable demand, promotions, for example, but sometimes that unpredictability just exists. But we can normally measure how unpredictable it is, and using the maths again, you could say, okay, even though this supply chain's a bit more variable, if I want to make sure you've got all the stuff you need, I need to hold this much buffer. The problem is those buffers cost money. And quite often the way that we look at the value of an organisation, a company, will want to reduce its working capital, and therefore it puts pressure on the organisation to remove those buffers because those buffers cost money. So actually I'd argue perhaps some of the reason we weren't as buffered as we could be during COVID, though we were actually pretty good, wasn't necessarily because of just in time, it's because we're not necessarily always aware of our buffers and what they should be. And even if we are, we might not be able to, we may not want to take on the financial burden of actually putting those buffers in place. So actually what I'm describing to you is a very proactive strategy of how I manage both my supply chain demand and my supply strategy and the right buffers to make sure that I can deliver a required level of customer service. But all too often what we see in supply chains is people just reacting because those buffers aren't in place. And similarly, if we're only producing for what we need, not what we want, we're likely to be producing less. So that would also reduce the amount of buffer that we need. Now, within supply chains, we can think of these buffers coming in two types. The first, let's go back to my COVID example and toilet paper, is what we would call dynamic flexibility, or the buffer that you need to respond to variations in demand for a supply chain that's not necessarily going to have to reconfigure as a result of it. So actually during COVID, we didn't run out of toilet paper. Actually, our supply chains had enough stuff. Some of the supermarkets had to ration toilet paper because we as consumers tried to consume at an abnormal rate, not because we were using more toilet paper, but because FOMO kicked in and we were worried we weren't going to get enough, so we tried to take too much. And so actually the supermarkets quite often intervened and said, no, you can only have a set amount of toilet paper. And in that way, we didn't actually run out. But equally, and that's what we call dynamic flexibility. It's where a supply chain just responds within its natural network design to those variations in demand. However, also during COVID, we suddenly saw demand for things like personal protective equipment, PPE, or ventilators at a rate that we'd never seen before. And what they required was the actual whole supply chain to reconfigure to meet that need. Now, it took a little bit of time, but we did it. We also did it for things as complicated as vaccines, and that's what we call structural flexibility. And to do that, you need to have a better understanding of your whole network design and where those buffers sit within it. So actually, we can be very resilient. We can make sure people have what they need when they need it. But critical to this is being proactive, having good buffer strategy, and understanding what people really need, not just what they want. So we're going to deliver things at the lowest possible cost or think about supply chain productivity. What we need to do is change our mindset from thinking about just an individual firm, because historically, this is how we've optimized business. It tends to be by looking at a single unit. Normally, the firm that's most optimized are the OEMs or the retailers, the OEM being the original equipment manufacturer or retailer at the start of a supply chain, the connection to the consumer or the end user. And they will organize their operations so they're most advantageous for that firm. What that tends to mean is that they pass on a very unpredictable or variable demand signal to the rest of the supply chain, who, as the supply chain goes on, that demand signal through the bullwhip effect gets worse and worse and worse. And so typically then to meet demand, those firms need more and more buffers, which are costly, particularly as those firms tend to have access to finance at a much, much higher cost. This could be avoided, though, if some of those firms at the head of the chain also really understood the power of supply chain planning. But often, those firms, the most dominant function within their supply chain is procurement. And those procurement functions have been set up in a way to achieve better productivity by really driving down the cost of supply of parts or materials into their business. Their procurement function is very driven by gross margin and getting stuff in at the lowest possible cost, without necessarily realising that that cost in the longer run might not be sustainable. And that procurement-driven approach also tends to work against this sort of longer-term and end-to-end planning approach too. And furthermore, what they'll also think about is demand as being a singular demand pattern, when more often than not, we can segment demand into an underlying base demand. And in over my 20 years of looking at supply chains, I haven't found a single organisation, be it a submarine, warship, pharmaceutical, toilet roll, that hasn't got at least 60% underlying demand, because we tend to consume things in a repetitive way. And as we said before, that stable demand is our best demand, because actually we can minimise the buffers that we need to still fulfil that customer demand. And if we can isolate that unpredictable element and only have the right size buffers for that, we can ultimately deliver customer value at much, much lower supply chain cost and ultimately make our supply chains much more productive. But to do that, as I say, we need to think supply chain, not firm. We need to think planning over procurement, and we need to think segmented rather than a one-size-fits-all supply chain. And if we're going to do this in a sustainable way, we need to think about making sure that our supply chains are powered by low carbon energy rather than fossil fuels, that when we design our supply chains, we design them in a way, a bit like my clothes from Vinted, to stay in their highest possible value state for as long as possible, supporting a more circular economy rather than a take out the ground, make things, dump things, linear economy mindset. And we need to think about how the entire ecosystem works together to do this, not just individual firms. And regardless of how we look at this challenge, industrial digital technologies, or IDTs, have a critical part to play in this. A study that I did back in 2018, when we were looking at supply chain digitalization, identified 4 different ways that digital technologies could help transform supply chains. A few years later, when we were looking at how we could achieve a more circular economy, we can't move to that circular economy without the use of industrial digital technologies. And Made Smarter itself can see that digital technologies are going to be moved along that value train, right the way from data capture, data visualization, pattern finding, autonomous decision making, factory design and operation, waste stream analysis, and circularity itself. So we cannot have a future without digital technologies, which gives us a huge opportunity. Now, when I first started out working in manufacturing and supply chains, I remember a manager saying to me, it's better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. In other words, just get on and make a decision. The reality is now, with the access to data and computing power that we have this once in a lifetime, in my lifetime, this new opportunity to make better decisions, and we can be precisely right. So the work that we've done through Interact has been around developing an approach, a 6-step methodology to actually help us think about how we create the future of digital manufacturing ecosystem that we want. It starts by actually trying to get people into a 2040 mindset and to think about what that future is that they actually want. And we've managed to achieve this by actually helping people to get into a new mindset space. And then actually from that, they can start to think about the design principles, the future business models that they need. That's part 1, visioning. And then once they've got to that stage of knowing what it is that you want to create, then in the delivery part, we can actually start to think about how you deliver the future ecosystem, shape the external forces, and capture the future practices that you need and the way that digital technologies are going to support them. Now, this is a different approach because up until this point, scenarios have been developed thinking about today and today's drivers, and then extrapolating out normally into 2 or 4 scenarios of the future based on thinking about the different directions those drivers could take us in. But the reality is we're in a world at the moment that is changing so much. It's really, really hard to think about those different drivers and how they're going to change, because actually what we know is that change is the only constant. So rather than trying to think about the shifting sands that trying to reorientate to these drivers changing is going to create, let's ignore that and let's take a much bolder view and start by thinking about what it is that we really want, and then working backwards through this backcasting approach to get to that future. And thinking then how we shape those drivers to enable us to deliver that future that we want, and how we use those digital technologies to help us to shape those drivers. So this has perhaps been one of the most inspiring projects that I've ever been involved in. Now, the first step of this, we realised, was that actually many people already embedded within supply chains and manufacturing ecosystems are quite embedded in today's thinking, and they find it really, really hard to imagine what 2040 or 2050 might look like. So after conducting around 30 expert interviews with people that actually find thinking about the future much, much easier, we managed to capture 33 snapshots of the future. Now, those snapshots are like little postcards, and the idea was that those snapshots, they won't all appeal to everyone, but that everybody perhaps can see elements of those snapshots that they like. Now, 33 is a lot of things to look at, so just to help us make better sense of them, we thought, how could we group them? But in thinking about how to group them, we asked our challenge director, Ben Farmer, and he suggested, you know what, the UK government and every government around the world really wants 4 things. They want to be more productive, productivity powerhouse. They want to be more resilient. Flexibility is standard. They want to be more sustainable, sustainability champion, and they want better jobs, happy and sustainable workforce. So we took our 33 snapshots and then we grouped them into a number of visions and then a number of scenarios, and we created our version of a manufacturing coffee table book, which you can download from our website. And what you can see here is that each of those scenarios down the left-hand side mapped across into 3 different visions. And then each of those visions, as you can see here, then mapped out. And each of those little dots in a different colour represents one of our different snapshots, and the colour then represents which vision it sits in. In some respects, it's totally irrelevant, all of that, because when you first see the snapshot cards, you just see them totally independent, and all that they're meant to be is inspiration to try to clear your minds and to get you to think about the future in a different way. But interestingly, there were 3 common themes that sat across all of those snapshots if we think about it. The first is that the future isn't going to be necessarily collaborative, it's going to be cooperative. That perhaps what has held us back is that we keep talking about the need for collaboration, but we've never really worked out how to do it. And that's because everybody wants to be a winner. So it's better to be honest and think about, actually, we need to collaborate to compete, and each individual player needs to win in some way. They need to, as well as giving value to the ecosystem, they need to find a way to get value out of the ecosystem. So being more honest about this and thinking about co-opetition could be very helpful. The second thing, which I've alluded to, is we can't think about manufacturing, the future manufacturing ecosystem being linear. It could be that different countries, actually the major role they're going to play is through remanufacture, through repair, or through reuse. So actually, as we start to develop our supply chains and manufacturing ecosystem of the future, we have to think about it with circularity right at its core. And last but not least, we can no longer optimise or think just about individual firms. We have to think about the firm's role in an ecosystem. So for instance, manufacturers at the moment may not just be struggling because of producing the actual goods, because the price of their goods is determined by the price of utilities such as electricity and water. If the price of electricity is very, very high, it can make a manufacturing location uncompetitive. If your data infrastructure is not cyber secure, it puts your organisation at risk in a different way. So actually, we need to think much more about the broader ecosystem, some of those other players such as utility providers, finance providers, insurance providers, and how they will support manufacturing of the future. And all of this will be digitally enabled. So as you embark on your journey and use our methodology, you may choose just to use part 1, visioning, though I hope you also want to move on to actually think about how you're going to deliver it. But some of this is actually about how you as leaders, the people leading this transformation, think about it. And some of the insights that I took away from attending Davos back in 2025 was perhaps that we need to think about the future in a different way as leaders. The first of those was that we can't be wildly optimistic, having claims about the future that no one's going to believe in, but equally, if we just fill our press, whether that be the national press or the narrative within our own organisations with negative sentiments, then we're just going to demotivate everybody. So actually what we need, or the best leaders will be able to do, is to toe that balanced line and have cautious optimism so that we can think about that future that we want and bring people on the journey with us. And I actually think our methodology for looking at a future digital manufacturing ecosystem can help to do that. And what that requires is courageous leadership, because that's actually quite a scary place to be, because you're pinning your hopes on a future. But actually that's why, again, our methodology can help you do that in a collaborative way, that you bring people with you. At the heart of this, though, is that need to be able to decouple consumption from production. So we're going to have to think about rethinking growth. And also, We do make good progress in this world, but actually what we report in our newspapers tends to only be negative things, because actually small incremental improvements aren't necessarily always newsworthy. So within your organisations, always think about where you were and celebrate those small successes that actually help to move us forward. And last but not least, supply chains are global in their nature. And not one country can do everything itself. I think there's a real opportunity to use our framework to help us to think about how we, within our manufacturing ecosystems, responsibly re-globalise. So, in the words of somebody far more eloquent than myself, William Wordsworth, I would just like to end with this thought. Life is divided into 3 terms: that which was, which is, and which will be. Let us learn from the past to profit by the present, and from the present to live better in the future. Good luck on your digital journeys.